Here at Easy Build. As you've seen, this is a highly innovative company, and this is exactly what we want to see a lot more of in the building and construction and housing sector in New Zealand. To be able to deliver houses in a standardised production mode like they can means that we get flat pack houses, we get them built much faster at a lower cost, and that's a good thing for housing here in New Zealand. Also just want to acknowledge David Kelly from Master Builders, who's here as well. It's great to see him and thank him for all his work with Master Builders and all the work that they do. But obviously, we have a plan to make sure we rebuild the economy, and a big part of it is cutting the red tape and making sure we actually build more houses in this country, and that's what this visit's been about today. We have a major challenge. Our building costs have gone up 41% in just the last 5 years across New Zealand. To build a house here in New Zealand is now 50% more expensive than it is in Australia, and so that's why we are determined to actually open up overseas building products into New Zealand, and the Minister will talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but we want to make it easier and cheaper to build. And what that means is for families across New Zealand who are trying to get into that first home, if it's built faster and quicker and cheaper, that's a good thing. For those folk that want to extend and add another bedroom to their house, that's a good thing, being able to access overseas building projects because we've got more products, more competition and lower prices and lower building costs. That's a very, very good thing for New Zealand. So I just want to say it is great to see that we already announced our 36 quarterly action plan, and this is one of the actions on it, and the Minister's got well ahead of it and actually delivering it well ahead of schedule, and it's just fantastic to see this announcement of being able to access overseas building products so that we can make things cheaper for New Zealanders, so we can lower the cost of living, so that we can get houses built and we can actually rebuild the economy in the process. And with that, I'll pass off to Chris to talk a little bit more about the announcement.
Good morning all. Thank you, Prime Minister. As you've noted, the importance of rebuilding the economy and the place that building and construction sector has within that. If you think about the Kiwi families that are doing the renovation or the new build and that going for housing growth agenda that we've got as well. So clearly building products are an important part of that in turn. We're also doing other work in the building construction space. We've talked already about raising the threshold at which a building levy must be paid up to $65,000. So there's a whole number of projects of a smaller nature that will be able to avoid that red tape and expense. We've talked about requiring building consent authorities, essentially councils, to report the data of their building consent processing times. We think that'll add accountability for the system as it currently exists and help inform our options for reforming the structure of those building consent authorities as well. And then last week we also talked about in the rural environment having buildings that are used for water storage or dams requiring a bit less red tape, so up to 4 metres height. That's the threshold at which they need a building consent, but also will be the point at which they will need to be certified for safety going forward. So a bit of a win there for some of our rural community, again as part of that bigger picture heading of rebuilding the economy. So what we're announcing today in terms of shaking up the building product system is threefold. First, it's about recognising overseas standards systems. So to say, for example, if we look across the Tasman, that in Australia, if they've got equivalent, equal or higher standards of building products that can be measured against, then that's something that we're keen to lean into and use. Second, it's recognising where individual building products from overseas have already been measured against and found to comply with overseas building standards. So to require that building consent authorities in New Zealand would take note of that and not have to do the work again in terms of working out whether those standards have been met. And the third is to recognise overseas certification systems. So again, to use the Australian possibility as an example, the watermark system in Australia would allow us to have some 200,000 additional building or plumbing products rather to be able to be considered safe and available for use in New Zealand, again without having to go through that extra step at each individual council or building consent authority level. So we think there's going to be some good wins in there. We'll look to pass legislation that will enable the structure. We'll be consulting with the sector, the people who actually use the products, people who have got that technical know-how to see exactly where we should put those lines in place in terms of acknowledging the equivalent or better, higher standards from Australia. And we think in addition to providing the competition that the Commerce Commission talked about in relation to plasterboard and the jib shortage of a couple of years ago and those easier product approval pathways that the Commerce Commission also talked about, we think actually for New Zealand producers of building products that be a win as well, because we think that if they can measure themselves against overseas standards, that makes them much more export ready and attractive in Sydney and Melbourne, elsewhere in Australia, and of course further afield too.
What countries might the building materials be coming in from?
Yeah, I mean, we'll look across the whole map, and that's work that's got to be undertaken. An obvious starting point would be Australia, just because of the similarity of jurisdictions in terms of the way that we've got, a rule of law kind of system, but also in environmental conditions, a lot of obvious similarities. But we'll also look, and there might be other, countries around the world that we think do things pretty well. They've got a good engineering reputation, they've got good performance over a long period of history, and we'll, take quite an expansive view of what ones might be appropriate.
And would we have our own checks and balances here in New Zealand to make sure that these products are legit, or would we kind of just copy what Australia's?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. In terms of having equivalent, comparable jurisdictions, so I emphasise comparable because, there might be differences in regions of the world where it might be that for meteorological or seismic conditions in New Zealand, to the extent that those are different and we can't justify using the same, then we'd take a nuanced approach there. But there's also a safety level within New Zealand whereby we've got the building consent authorities still have to approve the building project overall. So, for example, not only that the product itself is robust and of a high quality, but also that it's going to be used in a way that's appropriate.
Because there might be a different climate in one of these overseas jurisdictions, so there will still be something that here in New Zealand that will check that you can use that product here in New Zealand and will match our climate?
Yeah, that's right. But I also think it's worth acknowledging we've got great variation within New Zealand as well, so we'd see how those things interact with each other. And as I say, that's why I emphasise comparable, so they need to be comparable jurisdiction. And it might be that the consultation with the sector highlights that there are some jurisdictions that we can say will take certain aspects of their building, maybe not structural, maybe not in terms of weather tightness or whatever, but we've got to get that detail right, and we're committed to doing that by working through the process, talking with the people who've got that technical knowledge.
The only thing I'd say also is that, we have 5 million people in New Zealand. Yes, we have some unique weather conditions, but actually, when you look at North America with 370 million people in it, with a range of weather conditions as well, that's sometimes used as an excuse. And the bottom line is, great houses are being built in other countries around the world that have equal, if not better, standards than New Zealand. And where those standards are like that, we shouldn't be afraid of actually bringing those international products into New Zealand. Why? Because we have a serious problem. Why are our building costs 50% greater than Australia? Why have building costs gone up 41% in 5 years? So we want more competition, we want lower prices, and we want more choice available so that we can actually get more houses built at a lower cost for people, so that makes a big difference to families.
What sort of impact will this announcement have on the GIB market? There was some talk from the last government that about 90 or 95% of that was controlled by, I think it was Fletcher's. So is this going to open that further and essentially crush that monopoly?
Well, absolutely. We expect a lot more competition on a range of products, but the difference that you're seeing here with this minister versus the previous administration is their first response was to form a working group around that. Our first response in 150 days or so is actually to pass legislation and get legislation passed to actually enable us to import in and bring in overseas products of comparable or better quality.
Well, where did she get to with that, or where did the government get to with that working group? Because that was announced about maybe a year and a half ago. Surely
I lost track, mate. What I'm focused on is under new management. When New Zealand's open for business under new management, we're here to get things done. We've been in power 150 days. It's fantastic that our minister has identified the problem in building and construction, and we're focused on looking out the front windscreen, taking the country forward, rather than worrying about what the hell happened in the past.
Sure, but isn't it worth using some of the research? I mean, say what you want about working groups. They got experts together to look at a problem. Isn't it worth looking at some of that research, what they came up with?
I just say to you, we are beyond the conversation of talking. We need to do things in this country, and that's why we were elected, and that's what we're here to do. That's why we've had a 100-day plan. That's why we've got another quarterly action plan. It's one of our 36 actions. We are opening up to comparable or better quality overseas products so that we can bring competition into the marketplace, so that we can lower prices, so that Kiwis get cheaper houses being built and they get to move on with their lives in a positive way. So that's where we are. And so we can debate and have working groups to discuss for a year and a half about GIB board, but it turns out there's quite good wall board that's used in North America for 370 million people. There's quite good wall board that's used in Australia and other jurisdictions around the world. So why wouldn't we think different to solve the problem that we have? The problem we have is building costs have gone up, as I said, 41% in 5 years. Building costs in New Zealand are 50% higher than Australia. We're saying unacceptable. We actually want to make sure we've got a more competitive market. We get our costs down, we get our prices down. That enables Kiwis to get into homes. That's great for families, it's great for New Zealand, and we're going to do something about it.
Prime Minister, just how big a win could this be for Australian manufacturers?
Well, I think it's a win for potentially, manufacturers in many different parts of the world, but it's also a win for New Zealand manufacturers as well. We have some great New Zealand manufacturers with great product. This is an and. We actually want them exporting their products to other jurisdictions as well, and we'd like to obviously open up to great products available overseas, bring it here as well.
How quickly can you adopt some of the Australian standards?
Well, I'll let Chris talk to that in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, well, the Australian system's one that we've looked at quite closely as an exemplar of what we could do in terms of getting on board. So in terms of how quickly that might be able to take place, the way we're going to do this is by legislating the ability to do this and then have, just to get in the weeds for a moment, gazette notices that say certain systems and products are going to be able to be usable. So it might be that, if we can legislate all the stages through by the end of the year, then there's no reason that we can't, immediately after that be having on board the first of them, which for argument's sake could be across the Tasman.
So new products arriving next year is likely?
Yeah, I'm certainly aiming for that. We'll take the time that we need to get it right, but actually the imperative of being able to build much more quickly as part of that bigger piece of rebuilding the economy does indicate that pace is needed.
So for those local, that figure around how much it costs to build here versus in Australia, how much of these changes will reduce that?
Yeah, well, building products are obviously part of the overall picture. They're not the whole thing. So we're sort of doing all the different bits that we can. So, to the extent that we can control building product prices, not in a mandating kind of way, except to open up that competition and let the market forces put downward pressure on prices. That's going to be helpful. In terms of the other bits of the system, you've got processes. Obviously, we've talked a bit, highlighted a bit the intention regarding building consent. Authority reform. You've heard us talk about, in conjunction with coalition partners, having dwellings of up to 60 square metres, not needing a building consent. So that'll make a difference as well. So there's a whole heap of different things that all need to happen, but the key is we've sort of got to get on with all of them. That's why I'm really pleased that within this Q2 plan, we've got this as one of the 36 items.
So
those locally made products.
Figure on it, though? I mean, this announcement is framed around wanting to drive down the cost of construction. So can you tell us in more specific terms how much it's going to perhaps level the playing field with respect to New Zealand and Australia building costs? Well,
no, I mean, we can't control obviously what Australia does. I mean, if they're going to be smart enough to do an equivalent thing and make it easier to get the New Zealand products there, then good luck to them, I say. But we can only control what we can control ourselves. So the thing to do for us is to maximise our opportunities, and we're going to look all across the world to be able to do that.
Is it the New Zealand government's intention to ensure or to drive towards New Zealand building costs becoming equal to or less than what it is in Australia?
Well, it just has to be a lot less than what it is now, and we haven't got a target around it or a number around it. But what I just say to you is that we've identified a problem, and the question is, once you've got a well-defined problem, which we have, high building costs relative to Australia, big increases over the last 5 years. The question is, what do you do about it? And there's a series of things that we're having to do, as Chris has alluded to. This is one of them, and actually liberalising and open up market access from overseas products from jurisdictions that have comparable or better standards than New Zealand. We should be very embracing of all of that. And we haven't been doing that. And when I look at Australia and I think about plumbing products in particular, that looks like an easy first win for us. And why on earth would we have a completely different approach in New Zealand that's so different because of 3 hours of water than what we have in Australia? And if it accesses more products at lower costs and means cheaper builds, that's a good thing. So this is it's just again what I've observed in coming into government is there's a lot of solutions that go roaming around in search of a problem. We have a different approach. We define the problem well, and then we put common sense, practical answers in place to answer those problems.
Can I just go back to
Well,
main product?
square metre change. When's that going to happen?
We don't have a time frame that specifically because there's a lot of different moving parts, but I'm really hopeful that in conjunction with Chris Bishop, for example, who's leading the work around resource management change, that we get all that stuff well aligned. So, I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to say through the resource management changes he's doing that you're not going to need a resource consent that would slow things down even before you get to the point of not requiring a building consent. So I think you'll see some action on that this year.
Can I just go back to what you were need to be exported before they can kind of benefit from this kind of rule?
Say that again.
will locally made products need to be exported before they can kind of benefit from this?
Well, locally made products today can export all around the world, and we've got some great manufacturers here in New Zealand. We have a major desire to double the amount of exports out of this country in the next 10 years, and so we encourage anybody in the building sector products space, rather than just providing for the New Zealand market, get offshore and foot it with the world, and if you've got great product that consumers want and customers want, go sell it around the world. But what this is about is, at the same time, we need to be able to open up New Zealand to actually recognise that there are hundreds of millions of people living in perfectly good houses that have building product regimes of comparable, if not better quality than New Zealand, and those products haven't been available in this country. And it's part of us saying it's unacceptable to have a 50% higher building cost in Australia as our nearest, comparable sort of country. And so we've got to do everything we can to start to march that down. And part of it is opening up the building products. Part of it will be the other reforms that we've talked about today, and we're going to continue to talk about through the course of the year.
Can I just go back to what you're saying about working groups? Research from the Parliamentary Library shows that in the first 100 days of the Labour government, they formed 20 working groups. In your first 100 days, you formed 16 working groups. So is it a bit of hypocritical for you to have a crack at the previous government?
I kept count of the previous administration's working groups. They showed up in 2017 with no idea how to lead and a program to actually execute as government, and what they formed was over 230 working groups. What we've had in many cases is technical advisory teams that are short, sharp, surgical, duration of time.
It's just PR spin. You're just putting a different name on it. Yes, you are.
We don't have endless working groups dreaming up policy. What we've got is actually, we've got policy. We want to make sure our focus is around execution and implementation. So that's what we're focused on. If you think about Bill English, about to deliver his report on Kāinga and the review, been short, sharp, surgical, just a matter of months. The same thing's happening in a number of areas around Three Waters and other things as well. So, that's where we're using experts in the implementation of getting things done, not in the discussion of what should we be doing. We know what we want to do. We want to rebuild the economy, restore law and order, deliver better health and education, get the country back on track, get the country and the economy growing so we can get the public services we deserve. So we have a clear imprint of what we're doing. We want to execute with speed, and if that means that we get some technical advisors for a couple of months to actually execute things and get things done well, so they bed in well, they get done, they get delivered, that's what we're focused about. So, but we know what we're doing, and we have a plan for New Zealand, because that's what New Zealand is crying out for right now.
Prime Minister, can you just give an outline of what you might be talking to the Australian opposition leader Peter Dutton about today, and also just about your involvement with the International Democracy Union or Alliance or whatever it is while it's in town?
Yeah, the IDU is a grouping of centre-right political parties from around the world that meets in different locations. We're hosting them here in New Zealand for the next few days.
Because you guys would be a bit of a success story, wouldn't you?
Well, that's for others to say. But I think we've done a great job over the last 2 years to get ourselves to government and to get elected, and most importantly, get a plan for New Zealanders. But what I'd say is it's quite normal. I've met Peter once before on a quick trip to Melbourne, and as I met with Anthony Albanese as opposition leader and Prime Minister Lee in Singapore as an opposition leader, it's quite normal.
Absolutely.
I want to have a stronger relationship with Australia, and that means actually having strong relationships across their whole political system. That's why I've also met with the Premier of Victoria recently as well, Jacinta Allen, because I think I want to have a multifaceted, multi-levelled relationship with Australia. I'm not sure. We'll talk about generally about what he's observing in the economy, how he feels things are in Australia. I'll talk a little bit about what things are in New Zealand, but also how do we build that Australia-New Zealand relationship. That's really the focus of our conversations.
Would you like to see more hydrogen extraction in New Zealand?
Look, that's a possibility. I think we're determined to make sure that we deliver more renewable energy, and clean hydrogen's a really interesting proposition. It's just I know every country in the world is talking about clean hydrogen, and we can keep talking about it. We've got to try and mechanistically work our way through it and say, well, how can we do it differently, better, and what role can it play in our system?
Who owns hydrogen?
Sorry?
Who owns hydrogen?
Do
you think Māori had?
Well, that's not a conversation we've got into at the moment. What we're focused on initially, as I said, we're being very intentional. We're focusing on the things that we're saying are must-dos right now, and there's a lot of things that we want to get to ultimately. But for this period of time, we want to actually in this next quarterly plan action, our progress towards doubling the amount of renewable electricity in New Zealand. Hydrogen's an interesting conversation. We'll have that conversation in due course, but for right now, that's our focus.
Public sector cuts keep coming.
You mentioned that New Zealand has a large number of VCAs.
Yes.
And other countries might just have one.
Yep.
Will you be looking to reduce the number of VCAs?
Yeah, that's something that we want to get into that conversation as well, because obviously every council essentially, a business like this has to deal with multiple councils up and down the country. If I look at other small advanced economies that are 5 million people, they make that much simpler for people. And again, that's one of the things that's adding to cost. Some councils are doing it exceptionally well and are very innovative and forward-leaning and very embracing and very supportive and they build great relationships with the businesses that they work with. Others do a less good job. So, for us, that is ultimately something that we'll look at.
Do you have a target number and how will you?
No, it's just acknowledging that, when you talk to businesses and you get out, and it's good that you heard that, that is one of the frustrations. If you're a new business with actually a new model of, flat pack, homes production led like this, that requires a council to get its head around it, or a building authority, and you've got to do that 80 times in New Zealand. You don't just do it once or twice or 5 times. You've got to do it 80 times and build all those relationships. And you just think about the complexity associated with all of that, all the time, all the cost, all the energy, and the slowdown, and that gets added to costs, and it gets added to time, and that's families that aren't getting into a home at a good price. So those are the things that Chris alluded to before. He said we know there's a lot more things that we've got to do, but again, what's our problem? And then there's a series of common sense, practical solutions that we've got to work through. I'm organising things by quarters, as you can see, because we can keep talking about things, but unless we pick something in the building and construction space and say, right, well, what's our next step that we can do in the next 13 weeks? Let's go do that.
What would you say to the public servants who might be losing their jobs today?
Well, look, it's tough. It's tough for anyone losing their jobs, and as we've seen over the last 2 years, it's been tough for people in the private sector as well who have lost their jobs, and there's been a lot of people who have been there. I've seen a lot of hospitality businesses close down. I've seen a lot of small businesses close down over the last 2 years because of the economic mismanagement that the previous administration had. You cannot increase government spending by 84%. You cannot add 16,000 more bureaucrats. You cannot have more contractor and consultant spend going on, because all that did was drive into domestic inflation. That lifted interest rates. That's now slowed our economy down. 4 of our last 5 quarters with the economy shrinking, and rising unemployment's the consequence of that.
Well, are you concerned that the public sector kept increasing through to December?
Yeah, that was worrying. I read that report this morning that since the election there was more people hired in some government agencies, but the message is now pretty clearly understood since we've come to power that we are seriously expecting the public sector to make savings and efficiencies, to get rid of the consultants, to get rid of the wasteful spending, to stop the dumb programs, and actually make sure we free that cash up so that we can actually use that money in a different, more productive way to get better outcomes for New Zealanders.
Israel's Prime Minister is...
You've been sending that message for a long time, though, through the campaign and then your early days in government, obviously, well, since day one anyway.
Yes.
Clearly, the message wasn't getting through.
Yeah, it's really disappointing.
Your public service minister has said that she felt that the public service didn't take the previous government seriously. So, given the fact that they were clearly increasing FTEs during your time in government, how can you expect that they're going to
Since we were formed, since the election and the government was being formed, it is disappointing, because I think we did telegraph very clearly a couple of years out actually what our approach would be, because we wanted to clamp down on inflation, we want to cut down on wasteful government spending. So it is disappointing that that's happened by some of those agencies, not all of them, but some of them. But what I'd say now, it's crystal clear. We've had multiple conversations with every agency across the country, and the expectation's very clear.
Is that data going to prompt any further communication with government departments at all? Any need that you feel to send out another reminder that, hey, you guys need to stop hiring?
Well, we've been very clear in our conversations with different government agencies, those that were the fastest growers in headcount and spend. We are expecting a lot more from them.
So no extra comms needed?
No extra comms. We've been in constant daily dialogue with the CEs of the public services since the beginning of the year in particular, where we really cranked it up, and you'll see all that in the budget.
Israel's Prime Minister has claimed responsibility for an attack that saw 7 aid workers killed in the Palestine region. What's your response to that? Does Israel need to rein it in a little bit?
Oh, more than a little bit. We condemn that outright. I mean, that is utterly unacceptable. Israel has a huge responsibility to make sure that it operates within international law. That means protecting civilians and, importantly, getting aid into Gaza. That's why we have been calling. You've seen us make joint statements now with Australia and Canada, twice now, but we're at the UN as well, to say actually, we want a cessation cessation of hostilities, and we're encouraging. We need Hamas to release those hostages. We need Israel not to. I think going into Rafah will be catastrophic for civilians and for everybody there, when there's huge amounts of pain and suffering there. But they need to get around the table and actually talk about a peace process, because it's not going to be solved by more military action, and that's going to put more tension into the region. And actually, now is the time for all the parties to get around the table to talk about peace, to talk about how we make a pathway to the two-state solution, which we all want to see
Will
emerge
you
in that
convey this
region.
message personally or to the embassy here?
Well, we've been consistent in our messaging, as you would have seen, since we've come to government, from before Christmas to after Christmas, and more recently as well. We've made a series of statements to urge a cessation of hostilities in Gaza. There is no way that military action solves this problem, this conflict. And yes, we need Hamas to step up to the side, to the plate as well, and that means release the hostages. What happened to Israel on October the 7th was utterly unacceptable, and they need to be able to release those hostages. Israel needs to make sure that there's aid getting into Gaza, and importantly, innocent civilians are not caught up in war. And more importantly, stop the military action and get around the table and negotiate an outcome here.
Have you had an update on Taiwan and New Zealanders there?
Yeah, look, first and foremost, our thoughts go out to the people of Taiwan. We're a country that also deals with seismic risk and have had our own experiences. We think there's just under 140 New Zealanders there. We understand that they're safe at this point in time, but of course we would advise them to get on the Safe Travel website and to reach out to MFAT consular support if they need it there. But our understanding at this point in time is that all Kiwis there are safe.
Have you worked out the areas your public sector targets will target?
Well, we've been very clear. We expect a 7.5% savings overall of money. That's what it's about. And a lot of agencies are looking at stopping silly programs. A lot of the agencies are cut back on their consultants and contractors. A lot of them are cut back on their back office staff. And unfortunately, in some cases, there will be job losses as a consequence.
How effective are those targets going to be?
Well, they're going to be very effective, because we actually want more efficiency out of our public service. You cannot have a situation where we spend 84% more money, hire 16,000 more public servants, and deliver worse outcomes: health, education, the economy, crime. And so we're expecting to focus the public service on the things that are important. We're going to stop the wasteful spending that's been going on, because there's been an awful lot of it. And you've seen us do that in the first 100 days by stopping some programs that were going nowhere. Auckland Light Rail, Let's Get Wellington Moving, huge waste of money, not delivering an outcomes, stopped, finished, but we're expecting more of that to continue. But I'm expecting, what we're trying to do here is not just a one-off exercise of getting cost out of the public service or getting rid of the wasteful spending and the back office inefficiencies. What we're expecting to build back into the public service is something that's been lost, which is a culture of this morning. Someone woke up who's on a low and middle income, and they went to work at 7 a.m. this morning, they paid their taxes, they worked incredibly hard, and that money goes into government. And we expect every dollar to be respected, and that's the culture that we've got to get back into the public service. So this is about not just a one-off exercise for our budget, this is about a discipline of financial discipline that we're expecting to build back into the public service, so we don't have wasteful spending. Every dollar that we put in, we want it behind programs that are making a difference to New Zealand.
Those targets in the previous administration, were pared back in some cases. Like, how are we going to make sure that they're, achievable? Or
well, you've seen us being very clear about the work plan, quarter by quarter, that we're focusing the government and the public service around, and we're communicating with the public very clearly about that and transparently about that. But you'll also see me launch very shortly what we call better public service targets, because I want everybody being very clear about the direction of travel that we're going and the outcomes that we need to deliver for improving the lives of New Zealanders. And so that's going to be something that you'll watch out for. We'll talk about that in the next few weeks.
Okay, thank you everyone.
All right, guys, thanks so much. Have a great day. See ya.
disappointed not to see a tie.